Hello, team. It's me, Jonathan MS Pearce. I'm back with you for an ATP geopolitics video, a Ukraine war update extra, giving you the extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And in the words of the great Leeds band Kaiser Chiefs, I predict a rant. I predict a rant. So I predict a riot, but you get my point. Fun fact, I got a degree from the University of Leeds so many eons ago. Right, okay. Why do I predict a rant? Well, let's go to one of our resident Russian voices in a thread from one of my videos this morning. And this is Clive Engel, who basically regurgitates TASS, the Russian media, state media organization that just tells you every day what the Russian MOD are saying. And that is invariably a load of nonsense or communicating terrible things that the Russians have done and dressing it up as something wonderful. So, right, I have a real hard time with what Clive Engel has said here, and I think it's borderline despicable. I don't know, maybe I'm overreacting. Uh, I I am driven to defend what Ukraine are doing because of what is to me a really clear moral obligation. Even if I was an alien coming down to Earth and looking at what's going on here, I can't see any other conclusion than what Russia is doing as being morally uh, reprehensible. It is just terrible what Russia are doing. They are invading another sovereign nation. They've already illegally annexed to sections of that nation, whilst also conducting an illegal war that they've now admitted they had troops in an illegal war. Putin has openly now admitted that. And we have lots of troops also admitting that have been seen on the front lines as well, that they were fighting since 2014 in those conflicts. We have the committing of a whole host of terrible war crimes to a vast scale here. I mean, they far outstrip what Ukraine might possibly have done in terms of war crimes. I'd be amazed if at the end of this war, Ukraine won't have committed any war crimes at all. It's a war, it happens, right? It's human nature, it's horrible. But as far as I can work out, they are being the most careful nation I've seen because the cameras are on them and you've got social media and they know that any war crime that is seen, not only is it morally bad, but it has implications in terms of international support. Whereas Russia seem to have thrown caution to the wind and they are organizationally committing war crimes. Uh, it's all just terrible. And it's so blatantly obvious to me. And then when someone comes along and says this thing, stuff like this, I think you're being paid to do that, right? You may see this as my job, but I can say what I like, and I will not lie to you because I don't lie to myself. It I couldn't live with myself. You know, I go to bed at night. I used to say this with all my philosophy stuff, which is I believe really strongly in what I believe, philosophically speaking. And if there are areas where there is some kind of cognitive dissonance in my mind, some disharmony because I'm not sure about that conclusion over there, then I would find it really hard to sleep at night. I need to make sure that my entire worldview is built from the bottom up and makes sense. And if there are any bricks missing, I need to sort that out. I wrote a book recently. You don't need to know the title. I don't want to get God involved here, but it's all about like building from the bottom up, building your whole worldview from the bottom up so that it is really robust. Now, I am absolutely certain of that with regard to my moral proclamations in this war. And you have Clive Engel here talking about the cruise and Shahid drone attacks on Odessa last night, which were, as it turns out, one of the answers to the Kerch Bridge getting hit. So the Kerch Bridge was hit, right? And then Odessa was hit. And he says massive explosions early this morning, Moscow time, in Odessa and Mykolaiv, as shown in the Daily Mail channel. Of course, you cannot report that, as your masters will be upset. I have no idea what he's talking about. Ukraine always gets hit hard when they attack Russian targets. I mean, of course, if this was true, like I wouldn't be. If, of course, you can't report that, as your masters will get upset. I'm reporting what he says, which is that, I mean, this is demonstrably false, whatever he means by it. Anyway, Ukraine always gets hit hard when they attack Russian targets. So what he's saying is that if you hit Russian targets, it's almost as if it's unfair to hit Russian targets. You're going to get hit double hard if that happens. And because of the Kerch Bridge attack, you deserve this. Just like the opening days of the shock and awe and the illegal invasion of Iraq by the UK and US. Nice red herring, false equivalence, non sequitur, and all the rest of it there. The US and UK set precedents when it comes to invading other countries without cause. See, what he does there is by introducing these ideas, you start having arguments about this stuff rather than what he says. So Russia is just following the same mantra. So that is formally, and I've said this to you many times before, it's a form of whataboutism. It's called the two cockcrow fallacy. So it's like, and I'm sorry to repeat myself, but if you accuse me of murdering someone, and I have genuinely murdered someone, and you say, Jono, you've murdered someone, and I go, yeah, but you murdered someone 2 years ago. That does not justify, even if that's true, if you had murdered someone 2 years ago and you accuse me of murdering someone, and you're saying what you have done is morally bad, I cannot morally justify what I have done by saying you've done an equally bad thing. The situation is we've both done equally bad things, and it doesn't make your bad thing, doesn't make my bad thing a good thing. This is not moral justification. All you're doing is pointing out hypocrisy. That's all that does. But your accusation that I have murdered someone that's morally bad, while it might be hypocritical, is not an incorrect thing to say. So what? And this is such a common thing that people do, and it's just crap. Just Clive Engel, be better, right? So Clive here says, but you guys had this war over in Iraq, and that's all terrible. So like, yeah, okay, let's park that. We can talk about that somewhere else. Let's just stay on target here, and let's talk about what terrible thing you guys have done. But he continues, Condoleezza Rice, we don't want to wake up to a mushroom cloud on the horizon. Vladimir Putin, we don't want to wake up to a NATO naval base in Crimea. But the thing is, Crimea was Ukrainian, and if Ukraine wanted a NATO naval base there, that's up to them. What you've done as Russia is stolen that land and decided to put a Russian naval base there. And Crimea don't want what. So let's switch that around. Let's have Zelensky. We don't, or it wouldn't be Zelensky. So a previous Poroshenko, whoever, a previous Ukrainian. We don't want to wake up to a Russian naval base in Crimea. There you go. So it's all just nonsense. Afghanistan was invaded because the Taliban gave refugees to Qaeda, but NATO stayed for 20 years so that the Aussies, Polish, the Romanians, the British, and Norwegians, and Spain can test their weapons on Afghan civilians. Okay, just again, red herring. And now the Russians are testing their weapons on NATO panzers and Ukrainian civilians. Only fair. Right, now this is the key. This is the key to how morally abhorrent this human being is. Now the Russians are testing their weapons on NATO panzers and Ukrainian civilians. It's only fair. It's only fair that Russia get to test their weapons, think about Odesa and Mykolaiv, on Ukrainian citizens. He's justifying the use of weapons on Ukrainian citizens. It's only fair. Now, you can forget all of this, right? Because this is, as I've mentioned, the two cockcrow fallacy. What he needs to be able to do is, and especially it's even in a different context, it didn't involve Russia and didn't involve Ukraine. So it's like you accuse me of murder and I say someone murdered over there, right? It's irrelevant. So this guy is then saying, so really what Clive is saying is the Russians, it's only fair that the Russians get to bomb civilians in Odesa. And why this is doubly morally abhorrent is the following. Now, Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, has said, and this nails Putin, and it's reported speech, I don't know the exact quote, but after Russia's attack today on Ukrainian ports exporting grain, so the reason they hit Odesa and Mykolaiv is because this is where you take out grain to export it to out of the Bosphorus Straits to the rest of the world. Kerch was hit. The grain deal was terminated, as per Putin yesterday. And not only is the grain deal terminated, but they're going to hit the ports that contain all this grain. So who is that going to harm? Yeah, the Ukrainian economy, but who is it really going to harm the most? The people who would be needing to feed off that grain? Africa? Other nations? Okay. So Annalena Baerbock here is spot on. Every missile fired by Russia at the port of Odessa was the equivalent of firing a missile at people who are starving in the world. Absolutely spot on. The comment piled criticism on Moscow as Russia fired at Ukrainian ports a day after pulling out of the UN-backed deal to let Kyiv export grain. Reuters reports Russia described its wave of missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian ports as revenge, just pure hateful revenge for attacks they say are launched by Kyiv. Moscow's decision to withdraw from the grain deal prompted the UN to warn it risks creating hunger around the world. It's only fair, says Clive Engel. It's only fair. It's only fair to let people starve around the world. Exclamation mark, winky faces. Ah, it's only fair. Is it? Is it really only fair? Like, is that fairness? Is that, I don't know, morally decent? Is what Russia is doing morally decent? Just let's look at the, I don't know, is it approaching 100,000 cases of war crimes that Russia have purportedly committed? Should we look at them and see if they are only fair? Should we look at them and see if that's A-OK, that's morally on point? Let's have that argument, Clive, shall we? Yeah, despicable. So let's move on. We have, oh look, something else to do with the Kerch Bridge actually here. I don't know if I'm correct in my conclusion here. I'll be interested to see what you guys think. So residents of the temporarily occupied Donetsk region were restricted from travelling outside their region. The sale and booking of bus tickets was suspended. This was done so that Russian tourists from Crimea could travel unhindered by land after the damage to the Kerch Bridge. Kerch Bridge has been hit. The Russians in Crimea that want to get back from being on their lovely holiday in a war zone, because that's a clever thing to do, with the Kerch Bridge having been hit before, but they think it's not going to be hit and is building counter-offensive. They go on holiday to Crimea and, oh my goodness, the Ukrainians have hit the bridge. Who knew? Now we're going to have to go all the way around here. And Russia says, right, these guys, I'm wondering whether this is what's happening. These guys are more important than the people in the Donbass. Donbass is like a forgotten Rust Belt area of Ukraine. It's partly what drove pro-Russian sentiments. A kind of depressed region with a lot of manufacturing, what would have been a lot of manufacturing that has maybe fallen by the wayside over time, breeding support for Russia in years gone past. But Russia don't appear to care that much about the Donbass. They're just, mobilizing as many people there as they can find, whacking them into the army and sending them to potential deaths. And also saying, you guys can't move around because actually the tourists in Crimea are more important than you. You don't have a right to freedom, because their campaign is all about liberty, isn't it? It's all about freedom. You guys can't move. We need to prioritize Crimea. So no one's allowed to get bus tickets. I don't know. I'm probably overreacting there, but I do get a sense that your elites on holiday from Russia down into Crimea are seen as more important to Russia, to the Kremlin, than these parochials out in the Donbass. Here's a comment comes out of Ben Wallace, the now former Secretary of Defense in the UK, who recently resigned. Thin Russian lines. Ben Wallace has indicated in a recent interview, I heard quoted by Thomas Steiner but cannot locate it, that the defensive Russian lines after the first one are unmanned at this point. I discussed this in an earlier tweet from various sources. Mainly, the math does not work out due to the extent of the lines from satellite photos and the number of Russians available. Recent information shows units pulled to the front line from behind the zero line, named the name used by the Russians. Russian reserves have also been pulled to the front to counter Ukrainian advances. Those advances are still made without the bulk of the Ukraine assembled offensive mobile strike force of 10 or more brigades. Now, there is a caveat here. Like, those defensive lines don't need to be manned. There's no point having the fourth defensive line manned by a load of Russian troops, and a third and a second if all the fighting's taken place in the first. So these are arguably lines that you retreat to. So the troops that are fighting here at the first line, they get overrun, and they perhaps there are some reserves in that second line, but you're moving back to the second line to continue defending, and then you'll move back to the third line. It's not like all four lines are just going to be full of people. Where it gets interesting is whether you have enough troops to fill those lines kind of horizontally rather than vertically. So across those trenches, are there any weak points in those trenches? And as you come back and you're losing troops and you're going back to the second line of defense and you've got fewer troops in the first, you will need reserves to support you, and so on and so forth. So you will need extra people in those trenches, but it's not as if they're all going to be full. The Chechen TikTok unit was also pulled up to face advances by Ukraine in Klishchivka, retreating shortly after being engaged. The same Chechens dispatched to chase Prigozhin's Wagner group after it hit Rostov. This indicates that there are relatively few available units back in reserve at this point. Ukrainians have drawn the Russians into moving up artillery closer to the front by their advances, placing Russian artillery under devastating drone, HIMARS, and 155mm strikes. So the defense in depth plan appears to have been abandoned before it actually started. Lacking the manpower to cover large areas of the lines, Russians seem to have opted to engage Ukrainian units to at least try to dictate where the battles would occur. Waiting in defense would spread the troops too thin to be effective. Ukrainians have been effective at staging feints, like the 47th Mechanized Assault early on, that convinced the Russians to deploy reserves. The empirical evidence of this is that the front line, the zero line, was to be manned by Mobics or conscripts as a disposable screen, but the combat reports now show more veteran units engaged on the front line. That is a relative term, since those units are now heavily reinforced with conscripts to make up for heavy losses. This is really important. We've seen Marines turning up on the front line in places where you wouldn't expect them to have their kind of supposedly elite forces, just doing the basically bog standard defending trench lines from Ukrainian attacks. Reports from Russian generals indicate that units were down to 20 to 30% strength at one point and have been flushed out to 70% average strength by conscripts. The Ukrainians, to preserve their troops and equipment, have set up Russians in kill boxes on the front and then taken out artillery that would normally be much further in the rear. This has led to a very high artillery losses for the Russians. See the graphic, which is very similar to the graph I showed you yesterday. As of July the 17th, the Russian defense is now very brittle, meaning that it is overloaded on the zero line and taking heavy losses. The continued Ukrainian strikes on Russian infantry and artillery units will hollow out the defense before the breakthrough attack occurs. Interesting, although one might be slightly perturbed that the Russians are attacking in certain places and making small gains here and there. Kupiansk, northwest of Novovodyanye in Karmatianivka. We've seen some slight advances possibly to the northeast of Robotna, and even some counterattacks in the Pryutne area, perhaps. But each of those attacks will be attriting the Russian forces themselves, while the Ukrainians are not really committing any of their reserves. So I don't know that ultimately that will be to the Russian advantage. And it could just mean that they are thinning themselves out for any subsequent defensive actions they might need to take. Come to that a little bit later. Right, and talking about trenches, we can see the trench lines here on the War Mapper map. These are based on Brady Afric's map. And yeah, Tokmak, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of trenches in certain areas, and this appears to be where the Ukrainians are active a great deal at the moment around this area, which is quite odd for me because that seems to be the most concentrated area of Russian defences rather than, I don't know, coming around here. But there must be a reason for that. A great density of these trenches, particularly in certain places, Polyhi as well, and it indicates where they think the Ukrainians will go and also what they think has the highest value. So Tokmak here, obviously, being surrounded by trenches itself is a high value target as they see it. Polyhi and Bilmak too. Now, the question is, and I've been wondering this, I talked the other day about how the Ukrainians themselves have built trenches up in the Sumy area in northern Ukraine, in the Sumy area, sorry, here on their side of the border. So the Russians have trenches too, as you can see, but the Ukrainians have built their own trench lines and minefields and whatnot. And the question is, as someone asked quite correctly here, Kathy's guess. I'm curious, can you find out, or do you know if Ukraine is building up defenses behind these lines the way that Russia's built up their trenches and mines during combat in the forward positions? I don't know if that came out right, but in essence, is Ukraine building trenches and mines in case the Russians break through? That's a really good question. I don't know. And you would think it could be a pretty decent idea for the Ukrainians to build trenches in case there are Russian advances, but that's a huge front line to build trenches. And the Russians have done it. They could just throw conscripts and contractors and whatnot into the fray, and they've been doing that with wild abandon. I don't know if the Ukrainians have been doing that, but to start, I mean, that's a massive job, isn't it? To start to build up trenches from now, and I don't know whether it'd be fully worth it. But they've obviously thought it's worth it on the northern borders. Perhaps they already are. I'd be interested if anyone has any views on this, whether it's a worthwhile thing to do, and whether there's any evidence they are actually doing it. I mean, yes, it would be super useful if they did have extensive trenches. But I guess if you're feeling that you are going to go on the offensive yourself and take land, then those trenches get further and further away of where you need them to be when you are then being put onto the defense. I guess it talks to how confident you are of advancing yourself. And another question or another observation from someone, actually. This is from Glenn Greatorex, and thank you on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you for your generosity, Glenn. Really appreciate that. He says, as a layman, I have to say that Ukrainians, with what they have and what they have in front of them, are doing a brilliant job. Such a bloody tragedy for them. How's the Kerch Bridge? Clever buggers. I did have a think about this last night. I think this is an observation that shouldn't be overlooked. And although I may sound like I'm just fawning about the Ukrainians, they have actually done an insanely good job of resisting the Russians in so many ways. And one of them is their exemplary PR campaign that both reflects a clever use of narratives and information spaces, but also shows that they are just decent humans by and large. I am just amazed at stuff they do the whole time that just makes me wonder that if Britain was attacked, would we do everything in the same way? Would we have such integrity? Yes, there's always going to be people taking advantage. Yes, there's always going to be corruption. Goodness me, when you look at, I remember some time back before this war, I forget why I was looking into it, but the kind of crime that was going on around the time of the Blitz and people taking advantage of situations in London during the time of the Blitz, and you will always have people ne'er do wells who will take advantage of situations, and that's surely going to be the case in Ukraine as well. But just by and large, it's just been an insanely positive reaction to this war, a sense of unity and a sense of real moral clarity, and people showing that the best of humanity coming through. And you see the actions of their soldiers, by and large, appear to be really, really positive. It's an incredible job to have managed this war. And it almost sounds like it's a project, right? It's like a PR project or something. But they have managed this war in terms of communicating it to the wider world and giving us an insight into who they are, that I think they really have come out very positively. I mean, Ukrainians are seen in hugely positive light. Just think what you would have thought about Ukraine 5 years ago. Virtually nothing, most people around the world. You would have seen it as some ex-Soviet state type thing. And now a sense of what Ukraine is as a country, who they are as people, and the things they are doing. I just think that they have had so many opportunities to screw things up, to get things wrong, and they just haven't done it. They've just been it's just amazing, and that then feeds into, a wider international support amongst people like you and I, uh, or you and me, such that we continue to support them because we've got every good reason to do so. They are clearly, and and go back to my moral calculations previously. They're clearly the good guys, and the Russians are clearly the bad guys. And it's just there's no yes, that's massively simplistic, but it's also pretty damned accurate as far as I'm concerned. Right. And I guess a sense of this is here. Odessa, the wind tore off a flag from an administrative building, carrying passers-by, return the flag to its place. Seems to be a simple action, but it contains all Ukrainian patriotism. I don't think that song was playing though at the time. It just is this means something to us. It's not just a flag that's blown off. I'm not just going to return it to the building. I'm literally going to walk it across the road. I'm going to climb up the building. I'm going to put it back on because actually that's meaningful. That's meaningful for me and my compatriots and my friends here. And you see the problem I have with music, and I know I can mute tabs. Yes, this is an ongoing battle I have, and it will continue. And I'm not going to take the easy route out and just mute tabs and whatnot. But you put it on mute, and then you press up here, and then you press up here several times, and then occasionally it just unmutes it, and you're like, "But I didn't." Anyway, that's one for my one for fans of my mute battles. Right, going on to this. I mean, this is not for the first time. The Russian poster makers have previously, I think, shown a Ukrainian jet, I think a Ukrainian Su-25 or something, instead of a Russian one. Some I don't know, something they'd printed off or created or whatever. I can't remember. It's about 8 months ago. They've done this a number of times. Here's a big Russian billboard, and they've thrown in a Spanish Leopard 2 tank. No Russian Armata T14 tank advertising anymore. Copy the tank image of a Spanish Leopard 2E during a parade in Madrid. Yeah, well done, guys. Good effort. Right, I talked to you recently about cargo, shipping cargo around the world, and basically it's to do with trade, export and import, Russia and China and Russia and elsewhere, and saying that actually Russia is not really exporting much outside of those hydrocarbons, but cargo wise, they're not taking stuff to other countries, but they are importing certain things. Uh, but essentially they're not really doing decent trade, and so you've got really inefficient logistics taking place, and it basically shows you that it's just another indication that things aren't well at home, that things aren't economically sound at home. What you should see is cargo being delivered from one place to another, and then as that's offloaded, other cargo is loaded back onto whatever it is, a ship or a train, to go back in the other direction. You should never be transporting an empty cargo ship around the world. It's just an expensive waste. You should never be transporting empty trains around the world. It's an expensive waste. It's quite a rarity to see this kind of wastage, but that's not actually what this bit of footage is about. This footage is really about a massive bit of metal going across this empty cargo uh, carriage and smacking ruining the railway station the other side. It's just insane. Look out for that. And it's just just it's a gift that keeps on giving. And quiet. Well done. Good job. Finally, BMP2 equipped with an immense amount of improvised cage cover. Cope armor. There. That's a lot of copium going on. Wow. Yeah, this is like true Mad Max. It's just disguised as, I don't know, some garbage bins, I guess. And finally, let's do a little story about a Bradley. I presume this is true. There's going to be an element of good Ukrainian PR going on here, but it might show you the value of something like the Bradley, and maybe the difference between a Bradley and the equivalent vehicle used by the Russians. In this photo, the N2 Bradley that destroyed 2 Russian tanks in one battle. So that is that Bradley. Soldiers of the 47th Ukrainian 47th Separate Motor Mechanized Brigade, with the call signs Primara, Kach, and Bublik on their Bradley, worked in the Zaporizhia direction. The military already knows that Western equipment is a magnet for the enemy, and as soon as a Bradley appears on the front line, the Russians use everything they have, from grenade launchers to artillery and attack helicopters. This time, the combat vehicle was initially surrounded by Russian infantry on 2 sides, and when the invaders were destroyed with an automatic cannon, the Russians announced a real hunt for the Ukrainian Bradley. The enemy urgently introduced a pair of T-72s into the battle. Both Russian tanks were immediately burned. The Bradley is equipped with a heavy tow tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided anti-tank missile, which a crew skillfully used. This story was reported by the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Hanna Malia. So these guys took out 2 tanks and obviously a bunch of infantry as well with their auto cannon. Yeah, excellent stuff. If that is indeed how it works, and there's no reason to think it isn't really. So I'm sure we'll be hearing lots of heroic accounts of this kind of activity. I'm sure this sort of things happen on both sides, but here we have a Ukrainian Bradley doing what it was brought in to do. Anyway, thank you for putting up with my at times ranty rants. I really do appreciate you indulging me. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care of yourselves, and I will speak to you tomorrow.